What is up, guys? Welcome back to yet another tutorial. Today I will be talking about the one-arm handstand again. I don't know if you guys remember the video I made previously called 5 Things I Wish I Knew When I Started My One-Arm Handstand Journey. If you didn't, be sure to check that out later. But today I will go much more into details about the one-arm handstand. There are so many nuances with the one-arm handstand. There are so many factors that can go wrong. There are so many things that you need to have control over. So I figured I'd make a video about all of these little things that you should know, especially when you're starting your one-arm handstand journey, or if you are on your one-arm handstand journey and just need some additional advice and tips on how to continue your road forwards. There are basically 100 different ways you could possibly do a one-arm handstand. And what way is the best way? I guess no one knows. Depends on how you're going to use it, depends on a bunch of individual factors, your body, etc. But as a coach, I obviously have a preference regarding how it's easiest to approach the one-arm handstand. And today I'm going to give you guys some insights into my opinion regarding these things. Just to illustrate, a one-arm handstand could be performed like this with an anterior pelvis tilt, straddled legs, pushed out shoulders or elevated shoulders. Or you could have retracted shoulders, you could have a posterior pelvis tilt, like this. Or you could even have a large forward lean, like this, without flexed shoulders whatsoever. All of these variants are 100% possible. Which one is more efficient is also not as obvious as you might think. I mean, for example, contortionists, they usually have a large back bend in their one-arm handstand and they have not flexed shoulders at all, more something like this. And if done correctly, this isn't necessarily any less efficient than having flexed shoulders. And by flexed, I mean shoulders open like this, not flexed, is this. The only real requirement of a one-arm handstand is that your center of gravity is above your hand. This can be performed in hundreds or thousands of different ways, but your center of gravity is basically where your mass is equal on all sides, and this point needs to be exactly over your hands in order for you not to fall over. In a handstand like this, my center of gravity is above the point in the middle between my hands. In a one-arm handstand, this center of gravity must be directly above my hand. It's above my hand now. It's also above my hand now. So if you see the point, there are so many ways you could orient your joints and legs and shoulder and whatever. But there are a few things that I think will make it easier. In particular, if you don't flex your shoulders, you have them like this, then you have 2 options. Option 1 is to have a large back bend, like this, in order to get your center of gravity above your hand. And this way, if you can see, my arm is 90 degrees on the ground. It's pointing in the same direction as gravity, meaning I don't use an excessive amount of force. So this isn't necessarily inefficient. It does, however, require quite a lot of back bend. And you aren't able to straddle as much as if your shoulders are flexed and pelvis anteriorly tilted, like this. Here I'm able to push my legs much further down. Without bending my back. Now, the other way you could possibly do this is by leaning in your shoulder. So not having flexed like this, but no back bend also. And now you see I have an angle between the ground and my arms, not 90 degrees, so it's not pointing in the direction of gravity anymore. And this is not efficient, because this means we need to use a lot more force from our shoulders. Okay, enough about the hundreds of different ways you can possibly do a one-arm handstand. Let me focus on what I think you should do learning the one-arm handstand in order for it to be as applicable to other moves as possible, so that you can further progress your one-arm handstand into different shapes, and also to make it easier and as efficient as possible. So let's start with the most important thing, shoulder positioning, right? You probably heard it before, you should elevate your shoulders, pushing up. And in addition to this, you should flex your shoulders, meaning your arms should be in line with your body, more or less. Now this has a few functions. Firstly, the flexion of your arms will make it more efficient, like we talked about earlier, and it will also give you the opportunity to have a bigger straddle, which I will get back into. And the elevation of shoulders, meaning you push away from the ground and make yourself tall, because you could possibly do it with retracted shoulders too, like this. It's possible, no problem, but elevating your shoulders will sort of give you an extra life. Think Super Mario. You grow big, and if you fail, you just get small again. It's the same sort of principle. So you push tall, you lean over, and you lose balance, and you can use this to get back into position without falling. You sort of get an extra life, if that makes sense. In addition to this, you also get much more control over your shoulder, because you're not leaning into your joints or your socket. You're actually using your muscles to control the position, and with your muscle you can make adjustments. So this is why I think both elevated shoulders and flexed shoulders is important for the one-arm handstand. I practice internal rotation, meaning I rotate my shoulders and arms this way. And in a handstand, that means elbow pits facing each other. And this has a few functions, particularly when it comes to balancing. As you can see, my elbows are sort of balancing me in this direction. But this is a rather complicated topic that I will get back to in one of the one-arm handstand guides to come. But you can keep this in mind, and I think in the beginning the shoulder flexion and elevation is much more important, and when your position is stable, then this internal rotation becomes very important for the actual balancing of the one-arm handstand. Okay, let's talk about hip positioning, because that's a big thing in one-arm handstands and leg positioning in general. So there's a lot of confusion out there, I guess. Rather a full one-arm handstand or a straddle one-arm handstand is easiest or best or whatever. I think that the straddle handstand is much easier for the one-arm handstand. And by that I mean straddle like this is much easier than full like this. The full might feel sort of good in the beginning because your straddle is shitty. To me, it makes much more sense to develop a good straddle rather than spending a year extra trying to get the full, because your straddle is not good enough for the one-arm handstand. And the reason for this is that your center of gravity, as you straddle your legs, it moves down towards the ground, making it much more easier to balance. In addition to this, it's much easier to control your hips. You don't get all these wobbles all the time, like you would, for example, in the full. If you lose balance, and that's impossible to save yourself from. You don't get this to the same degree in a straddle. And your weight is distributed in this direction as well, which will make compensation much more easy when you're doing. It's much more easy to balance when you have a larger area on the sides here to compensate with. Think about walking a tight line. You see every circus performer doing this have this large stick, right? Because it's easier to balance when you have weight distributed on the side. It's the same principle. But in order to have a straddled handstand, when you're doing a one-arm handstand, you also need a particular hip positioning. Because most people, their joints in their hips stop them from doing a very deep straddle unless you have an anterior pelvic tilt, like this. I can move further down when I'm anteriorly tilting, but if I'm not, I stop here because my hip joints, they crash in the socket. This is very individual. Some people have naturally not as deep sockets for their joints, and it means they can move much more freely. But for most people, you're going to need to have this anterior pelvis tilt, which is the exact opposite of what people tell you to do when you're doing a regular handstand, right? So in order to have a big straddle, deep straddle, you need to anteriorly tilt your pelvis, push your legs down, and otherwise I would not come any further than this, which is often referred to as a small straddle in the handstand world. Your gaze, where your eyes look, is also important in a one-arm handstand. And I recommend looking directly down in the same spot between your hands as you're doing when you're doing a regular handstand, just keeping that gaze. Same spot, but this is also a preference thing, because I know a lot of hand balancers prefer to look closer to the hand they're leaning onto. But you could also look straight backwards, but that's super difficult. Or you could look straight forwards, which would require you to bend like a motherfucker. Is also not recommendable. To summarize this shortly, in order to make your life easier for the one-arm handstand, you're going to need a stable, solid shoulder positioning with flexed shoulders and elevated shoulders. It's not absolutely essential, but in order for the rest of your body to fall in place in the most efficient manner possible, this is what I recommend. And I believe that if you spend some time on your positioning before you start throwing your hand up for one-arm handstands, I think you can save yourself a lot of time. Now, in addition to this shoulder positioning, you're also going to need as wide and deep straddle as you can. So train your straddle, start stretching immediately, get used to this pelvic tilt, and train for this, both stretching to increase your range of motion, but also having an active straddle when you're upside down and learning to actually hold this position. This is different from this. It's also different from this. You see, the anterior pelvic tilt actually means I need to overflex my shoulders a bit because I get more weight over my hands, and in order for my forearm to stay in the direction of gravity like we talked about earlier, I'm going to need to flex my shoulders even more. So with these few points, you have a picture of what I think is important in the one-arm handstand position. So you can basically do a handstand however you want, as long as your center of gravity is above your hand, but you now know at least my recommendations, where I think you should put your focus to develop a stable, nice position for your one-arm handstand training. And this is only the first of many one-arm handstand videos that I am about to make and post. So remember to follow so that you get notified when the next video comes, which will be about how you should start your one-arm handstand journey. It will introduce a lot more drills and exercises that you can use. And if you're interested, I also have a one-arm handstand program in my app that you can check out, or you can just follow my channel here and wait for all of the next one-arm handstand guides to come. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.